Well, I have with me Tim Watson-Munro, and the next session is talking about moral injuries and the justice system. Tim's been, as you've heard in the intro, involved in criminal psychology for many, many years, and we've obviously seen him on TV more recently giving his opinions. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Kathie. A pleasure to be here.
So we've been talking about moral injury across all sectors of life, and it's been a fascinating discussion. Your career has really exposed you to the individual and often the stress when they're torn between their own moral compass and something they've either witnessed or done themselves or learned about. Would that be a correct observation?
I believe so, and I would add to that I've been morally injured as well by the nature of the work that I've done over, nearly 44 years now. Exposure to death, exposure to major fires, cadavers. I was previously a consultant to the Victorian Office of Corrections, and I would come in whenever there was a suicide in jail. I would go into the prison to debrief the prison officers, and more often than not, it was a crime scene. They had to wait for the coroner to arrive, and there would be cadavers hanging from the rafters. So I was involved in the Jaka fires. And of course, my first job, I was the resident psychologist at Parramatta Jail in Sydney. And the last year that I was there was violence every day, but the last year that I was there were 3 people murdered over internecine drug wars. So I've certainly observed it, and I have experienced it.
That's really a pertinent observation, because Zach Steele spoke about moral injury. None of us are resilient to it. You know, it's constant exposure to trauma, and it builds up in the psyche.
Yes.
How have you dealt with that exposure? I mean, obviously you've had some dark moments.
Yes, I described it in my memoir as trauma through osmosis, vicarious trauma, that it seeps into your soul by degrees, and it's a bit like cooking frogs, isn't it? Not that I've ever done it, but I've read about it where you put the frog in cold water and you gradually increase the temperature. Doesn't realise that it's being cooked. And I think that's what happened in terms of my own experience, that I went into a job, a very demanding job. I was young, I was 25 years of age, and it was the toughest jail in Australia. And I was poorly equipped to deal with all of that. But hubris and adrenaline and youthful enthusiasm and ambition overrode that. So it wasn't until, 20 odd years later, then I'd moved to Melbourne. I'd been involved in some other big cases, such as the Hoddle Street Massacre, the Jaka fires, as I mentioned, and just the sausage and potatoes of my day, murders, mayhem and rape, that I think had a bit of a breakdown. And I went into treatment for it. I developed a significant substance use disorder involving cocaine, which is a means of self-medication. And I guess through therapy, I unpacked all of that and realised really how fragile I was, even though I thought that I was coping. So I think it's very important for first responders, people who work in the mental health sphere, really anyone, as you say, that's exposed to multiple traumas, to recognise the pitfalls. How did I cope with it? Well, I had some time out from the profession, mandatory, imposed by the psychology board. I went into treatment. I looked at all the things that were causing my life to be so kind of dark, because I had severe depression, and, I eventually worked my way through it and worked my way back into my profession. And, I'm again doing big cases, but I have very clear boundaries in terms of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. I won't take on cases now that involve a lot of death and a lot of violence. a happy day at the office for me now is, you know, Bill from Baldwin, who's charged with drink driving. You know, it's pretty low key. I think I'm pretty much spent with the more dastardly crimes that occur in the community. But so that's moral injury for me. But I see it also in people that I have to assess. And the interesting thing, Kathie, it's not just about severe crime. It's not, for example, like that dreadful fire in Newtown in Sydney. You know, the night before last, 3 people died. Obviously, the people who went to that crime scene, the detectives, the police, the fire brigade, all those people, it's extremely confronting for them. But it's not only that. It can be moral injury in the workplace. So if people are undermined, if they're sexually harassed, if there's anything that deviates from their expectations and they're not supported, they have the potential to develop these issues.
So people talk to us in particular about when something like, for example, sexual harassment happens in the workplace, they're expecting people to go, that's terrible, I'm coming to support you and I'll do what we can, but they don't get that reaction. It's almost like a parallel universe. And what we find is that's what does the most damage, the lack of validation of the seriousness of the situation.
I agree with that. And clearly there's a big push on for people to do more now in terms of recognising it and rallying behind the survivor, not the perpetrator. I mean, I've had hundreds of cases over the years where people have been exposed to this type of bullying in the workplace, whether it's sexual harassment or a new person coming into the company.
We've lost your...
No, I'm back. I'm back. I'm going to switch my phone off so that it links up with my iPad. There we go. New people come into the company and they decide to put a new broom through the place, and people are invalidated in terms of all they've done throughout. And the reaction of the company in these cases has been not to support this hardworking, loyal, devoted, productive worker. It's to shunt them out the door sideways. And the damage that it does to these people, men and women, more so women than men from what I've observed, is enormous, because it takes away their sense of identity, that they are individuals who, and we're all guilty of this, I used to be too, where you define yourself through the nature of the work that you do, rather than saying, you know, I'm Kathie Melocco and I do this and I do that, or I'm Tim Watson-Munro, I'm a psychologist, but I'm also a father and, you know, I like to write and do creative things. So with these people, when you take that away from them, there's a huge vacuum, there's a void, there's nothing there. And then, you know, aggravating the process, they get no support from the company, or indeed in some of these cases, their co-workers who, for political reasons, they want to survive, step back and they ghost these individuals. And we've seen examples of this, I think, in Parliament House, Federal Parliament House in recent years. And, you know, there's clearly big cultural issues in terms of the way that place is run.
Yeah, what concerns me is leadership do not seem to be able to look at the wider environment. These things happen like a group think. It becomes a pack mentality. They go into a legalese response, and their lawyers respond to support it. Now, sure, the lawyer is the client. You know, they're looking after their client, but it's almost like there is no understanding of the damage they're doing to an individual. And many of these people, particularly women who've been sexually harassed, end up on workers' compensation, and they're abused even further because that system is not terribly supportive of those that have been through massive trauma.
Well, the process is a form of abuse in itself, and you're quite right that they they get involved in all sorts of litigation. And even for the most psychologically robust individuals, litigation is terrible. And I often say to people, you really need to understand what the pitfalls of this may be for you. It's rarely a quick fix. It's something that can go on for years. And if you're fighting a powerful, wealthy adversary, you'll be worn down in the process. So it's a form of abuse, and it compounds their emotional, psychological distress because of that. I think more needs to be done. We're trying to do it through people like Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins, and good luck to them, and fantastic, well done. They're raising awareness of these issues. But it's not just, in politics, it's everywhere. And there needs to be, I think, broader generic education about these issues. Companies, some do, they get welfare consultants in to discuss these issues, but I'm not sure how much traction it ultimately gets, because they come and go and they say, well, job well done, but nothing actually changes much.
Yeah, you've raised a really good point. I've often thought of the importance of language and emotional literacy, giving people an understanding of their inner world, because it's really only when someone is exposed to therapy that they start to understand, what do all these emotions mean to me? How am I playing out those emotions? Is it a role for workplaces? Because culture and behaviour go together.
Well, I believe it is. Getting back to the earlier point that many people define their identity in large measure through their workplace.
Yeah.
And so if the workplace isn't there to support them, it creates, I think, huge dissonance for them. And it can aggravate what they're going through already through the initiating moral injury that they've encountered. There needs to be more done. I mean, companies have employee assistance programs and so on. And some of those are very good. They're anonymous and all the rest of it. But unless there's an awareness, which is your point, that you're actually suffering this, you don't feel right, but you can't actually define it, you can't put structure around it, then you may not seek out that type of help. And moral injury, of course, it's a growing area. But practitioners need to be, I think, better skilled in that area and be more aware of the literature and so on. I read the book recently, or the excerpts from it, Dirty Work. What a great read, by the way.
Yeah, it was, isn't it?
There's not one job in that book that I'd want to have. Not one.
Yeah. In fact, I interviewed Isle, and I wanted to know what drove him to write a book like that, because the research in it is extraordinary. But he talks about something that's really interesting to the concept of moral injury and bystanders, and it goes all the way back to the late 1930s in Germany. And a sociologist, I don't know whether you've read this bit, was visiting Germany, and they were talking about the Nazi regime and wanting to know why no one did anything. And everyone was saying, the learned literati, oh, this is terrible, this is terrible. But then somebody said, but yes, we do have a Jewish problem. And he wrote an essay about it, in the fact that people want other people to do their dirty work, so to speak. And that's where the name Dirty Work came. And he was actually, in using that example, for me, we're never going to get across bystanders if people have those attitudes that we can't get over, as in, with the awful things that happened during the Holocaust. I mean, it's just because people often ask with, workplace bullying, which is a really important area to talk about in terms of moral injury. Why don't people do anything? But as you've raised, you have this mobbing that takes place, and the victim or target doesn't stand a chance.
No, I agree with that. And I was reading about the allegations surrounding Kimberly Kitching, for example, where in Parliament, yet again, she was ghosted allegedly by her colleagues and all the rest of it. And, I don't know if that contributed to her heart attack or not, but it certainly speaks to culture, and it speaks to, you can feel like you're part of the tribe, but if you stumble, it's almost like Lord of the Flies, isn't it? They just jump on you with great venom and passion. And what are the drivers behind that? Makes them feel more secure, I think, in part. You side with the strength. So it takes a courageous person to say, hold on a minute, this is morally wrong. You're ganging up on somebody who's very frail, and we really need to step back from this and give that individual some support. But I think that's rare from my observations.
Yeah, that raises like Christine Holgate. I thought she was incredibly brave to turn up to a parliamentary inquiry and admit she'd been suicidal, and the extraordinary depths that it had impacted her mental health to be admonished in such a public way, in an awful way. What do you think organisation leaders should check themselves on? I mean, in that instance, it was language massively, and it was amplification of that language, and it was power and control.
Yeah, I agree. Remarkably courageous. And, you know, the reaction of Morrison in the House was just really, in my view, very troubling. It was bullying, and she must be a remarkably strong individual to have endured all that and come out the other side. But I think that we need to be more aware of it. What we're talking about, amongst many things, is raising awareness of these issues, that these things that have gone on for time immemorial, that have become entrenched in culture, are not necessarily things that should continue. We need to change culture. We need to look at it and I think advance into the 21st century in a more kind of realistic way. But we still get the old school stuff. We get the, you know, you come in here and you adhere to the culture, or your face doesn't fit. That was a saying that I used to hear around Pentridge Jail when I was a consultant there back in the 80s. And new recruits would come in to be prison officers, and it was pretty quickly decided whether they would fit in or not in terms of the culture. And those that didn't, they would be told their face didn't fit. And then there would be all sorts of, you know, subtle and less than subtle undermining of their work capacity. And a lot of them went out on work cover, as it was then, with stress, highly depressed individuals. I've seen it in various police forces around the country. And I remember I had someone referred to me years ago, 80s, so, you know, 40 odd years ago, roughly, who was a new recruit to the police force in New South Wales. And nobody would work with him because he wanted to be honest and didn't want to take bribes. And he was having a major breakdown. As it eventuated, he left the job because there was no way he was going to overcome those well-entrenched kind of values that some hold within that organisation. I'm not saying all police are corrupt, by the way, but I think it does go on. And if you're not, you know, on the page, you're well and truly off the page, and there are consequences for that.
Yeah, and I guess mindful of our time, I want to talk a bit about the legal profession, because the legal profession is very much looking to stamp out sexual harassment within its own profession. But what concerns and bad behaviours. But what concerns me is it's not broadening to the actual client. You know, I know many women who've been targeted by solicitors and lawyers in the ordinary course of that confidential environment, and have been really harmed by situations.
Sorry, just so I'm clear, you're just talking about people that seek out legal advice who are then sexually harassed.
Absolutely. Right. And I think what I'm saying to you is that it's everywhere, Tim. So just because we have a learned profession, whether it's the law or something, or medical profession, whatever it might be, doesn't mean it's not happening everywhere.
I agree with that. It happens in the medical profession too. I'm not saying doctors hitting on patients, but I've certainly had quite a number of young doctors who are training to be specialists, and they talk about being sexually harassed by and bullied by senior consultants within hospitals. And you factor that into, you know, onerous working hours. And again, they're very strong individuals if they can survive all that. So, yes, I think it's endemic, and it's just one of many, many problems that people encounter in the workplace. but I think that a good start, it's happening, is raising awareness. People say this isn't okay. Some individuals, I think, cause moral injury through ignorance. In other words, it's not willful, it's not malicious, it's just the way that they've always done things, and they have no insight, really, and that's about education. You might you might get some traction there. So I think some of these individuals, certainly cases I've been involved with, when there's been some counselling about it, they demonstrate a motivation to change the way they do things.
Yeah, and I think that's important. The perpetrator is not always willful. You know, they may have a blind side, they may have an abrasive manner, which is perceived and received in perhaps the wrong, you know, a way that harms. So we're living in an era that is trauma after trauma after trauma. And on top of all of this, businesses trying to restart, trying to, you know, live and sustain their workforce. Is now the time to really bed down good human behaviours, and can it be done? Because people are so busy trying to survive.
It's a good question. I mean, look, I'm fundamentally an optimist. And I think if you're a psychologist and you think people can't change, you're in the wrong profession. So I'm voting for change, and I'm voting for people being responsive to change. But I'm realistic enough to know that not everyone wants to change. Some people don't want their behaviours and the culture of their business challenged too much. But that's no reason not to try. And there's certainly been a much greater public awareness of these kind of dynamics, I think, in the last 3 to 5 years, that what was previously considered okay is now recognised as not okay. And there are companies that are now jumping on really bad, inappropriate behaviour in the workforce and terminating people because of it.
Yeah,
so I'm hanging on to hope.
Me too. And what I hope is, though, we don't systemise it and take the human out of these situations, because in many regards, that's how we've got ourselves into trouble. We've got a policy and a process for that. Sometimes you have to have a human response.
I agree. And people are capable of changing. I mean, it depends on the intensity and the frequency of the felony, I guess. Mm-hmm. But with some individuals, I think, you know, the carrot is better than the stick. Let's try and turn it around by engaging both parties. And validation, we haven't discussed that a lot, but people who are morally injured, one of the big steps to healing is to have their grievance validated. And I think when that doesn't occur, then it just reinforces their grief in a big way.
It's fascinating, Tim, because that's exactly what we do. You know, as a chaplaincy, is the first thing that we do is listen, help clarify, and validate what's happening for them. And I've noticed a pattern, even if we come in late in the piece, the minute somebody is validated and their voice is recovered, there's a huge change in an individual that you see a beginning of a recovery. And I wonder whether that, I mean, therapy can only do so much. There is a time when people have to re-emerge into the world, and that validation is important in a different way.
I think it's essential. It removes the sense of being all alone in the universe.
Yeah.
That there are people who understand and who support you. And I think validation is almost a rite of passage in terms of recovery. Getting back into the same job, it's often very difficult. The prison officers that I saw years ago, they didn't want to go back. They were so kind of upset and traumatised, not only by the nature of the work, but the way that they were treated by their peers and superiors in the job. But occasionally there would be some validation, very, very occasionally, and it seemed to make a difference in terms of them moving forward. Whether they went back to working in a prison or doing something else, they were able to leave that behind. And in the absence of validation, I think it travels with people for a long time.
And I guess last question, simply because of the work that you do, how do people deal with when the law fails them? You must have seen many people that you've assessed that have had a result that is at odds with what we morally think is right. Can they get through that?
There's generally a lot of despair. And look, in the criminal justice system, I've seen, victims of crime, survivors of victims of crime where the victims died, and there's an acquittal. And those people, carry that anger and grief for a very long time. In the civil jurisdiction, by the time they get a decision, more often than not, it's been such a protracted process. I mean, it can go on for years, this stuff. I did a case recently where, the litigation started in the late 90s.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so, you got 20 years of this and that and appeals, and half a lifetime or more, a third of a lifetime for these people of living with constant stress, anxiety, trauma, anger. And then when it goes to court, and if they're unsuccessful, it can have a devastating impact upon them. On the other hand, if they are validated through a successful outcome, they can move forward.
All right. Well, do you perceive moral injury as a mental health issue? Because the research says not. The research says that it can coexist with PTSD and other mental health issues at the moment. It's still young. We don't know enough. It's multidisciplinary. But unless it's actually got a determined definition, how do we treat it? How do we acknowledge it?
Well, I agree with that. I think it's a separate thing to PTSD. Just by definition, PTSD involves death or near-death experiences. But it certainly encompasses symptoms of mental health: depression, anxiety, diminution of self-esteem, despair. But it's a separate structure, and I agree with you. It's a good thing to be able to define it differently, because the approach to it needs to be different as well. It may encompass supportive and motivational psychotherapy, chaplaincy work that you do, but I think at a broader level, organisational psychology and those types of things. So it is different.
Thanks for joining us, Tim.
It's a pleasure as always. Thank you.